Welcome to another week of devotionals as part of our Growing Disciples program, which aims to help us get to know God personally in a richer way, in a relational way. And it's for this reason that these devotionals are intended not to be overly academic, but rather to take the truth of the text and use that to stir us to respond to God. As we've worked our way through the book of Exodus over the past few weeks, we've been struck by the awesome holiness of God. God's person and glory was terrifying, even at a distance, down at the foot of Mount Sinai. So how could his living among his people of Israel possibly work? Surely they would be destroyed by his burning purity. Surely their inbuilt disposition towards sin meant that this is all going to end badly. But God had a merciful plan, a mechanism to deal with sin while at the same time protecting the people from his holiness. This system was all set out and constructed and arranged in the second half of the book of Exodus. The holy presence of God would live with Israel in a mobile, tented temple, a tabernacle. And a system of priests and sacrifices was to be established to deal with this problem of sin. By the end of the book of Exodus, this was all completed. It was all in place, even as God himself took up residence. But from a practical perspective, how does all of this actually work? The book of Leviticus explains that, almost like an instruction manual for the priests. And yet, there is so much more to this, sometimes misunderstood book. You might remember that it was the tribe of Levi, one of the 12 sons of Jacob Israel, that God had set apart as priests. So the descendants of Levi were the ones who especially needed to know how the whole system was to work, hence the name of the book, Leviticus. And it's the structure of the book which tells us this is a whole lot more than just how a priest is supposed to do their job kind of book. The whole is arranged to highlight the importance of a particular day in the national calendar, the Day of Atonement, that is especially designed to deal with this complexity of holy God living in the midst of a people with an inbuilt predisposition to sin. So here's one way of seeing the structure of the book of Leviticus, noticing how each section is paired with another, symmetrically around a central section which stands alone. So the first section, instructions for entering the tabernacle as sacred space, are set out in chapters 1 through 7. This is mostly about sacrifice, about the ritual that should take place. Second, there's a narrative about profaning that sacred space in chapters 8 through 10, and the priests come into view here. Third, there's this issue of separating clean and unclean in chapters 11 through 15, where purity comes into fore as a system of classifications where things can be clean or unclean, holy or profane. And this section begins to show how things could even move between each category. And then at the centre, the Day of Atonement, chapter 16. This is the centrepiece of the chiasm, that cascading structure that gives the greatest emphasis to this middle piece. It's got no matching pair. And then on the other side of the chiasm, separating the holy and profane. Once again, matters of purity are detailed, particularly in relation to things that are either holy or just ordinary. Then the next section down is narrative about profaning God's sacred name. In chapter 24, this section again puts the priests in the spotlight and the matter of God's holy name is discussed. And then finally there are more instructions for entering the promised land now as sacred space. This is a section rich in ritual once again, and it looks forward to when the people of God will enter the promised land and live there. The presence of God is actually within that promised land. So this structured with its mirrored parts climaxing in a central unit. This book of Leviticus is much, much more than just a recipe for sacrifices and rituals. It sets up the way that God's holiness will not be compromised, even though he lives among his people. The high point of which is going to be this Day of Atonement. And so within this framework, sacrifices actually do have great significance, and that's how the book begins. So to Leviticus chapter 1. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. He said, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when anyone among you brings an offering to the Lord, bring as your offering an animal from either the herd or the flock." Notice first of all that Leviticus is presented as direct revelation from the mouth of God. God speaks these words to Moses from the tabernacle tent of meeting, which is just inhabited at the end of the book of Exodus. What happens here now in Leviticus is understood as following on immediately from that. And so to the topic of sacrifices, particularly animal sacrifices. This means cattle from the herd, or either sheep or goats from the flock. There are other kinds of sacrifices as well. There's birds and grain and food, but the main idea here is that wild animals, or animals that have been caught or trapped, they're not suitable as sacrifices. Why? Well, presumably because they are not the personal property of the worshipper. Their value is minimal. Sacrifice by nature costs the worshipper. Something is surrendered. It is given over to God. And the first kind of offering described involves sacrificing an animal and burning it whole on the altar. So reading on in chapter 1, if the offering is a burnt offering from the herd, you are to offer a male without defect. You must present it at the entrance to the tent of the meeting so that it will be acceptable to the Lord. You are to lay your hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on your behalf to make atonement for you. You are to slaughter the young bull before the Lord, and then Aaron's sons, the priests, shall bring the blood and splash it against the sides of the altar at the entrance to the tent of meeting. You are to skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. The sons of Aaron the priest are to put fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire. Then Aaron's sons the priests shall arrange the pieces, including the head and the fat, on the wood that's burning on the altar. You are to wash the internal organs and the legs with water, and the priest is to burn all of it on the altar. It is a burnt offering, a food offering, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. So this kind of sacrifice involves the whole animal being slaughtered and burnt. It's not a sin offering, that's going to come later, but this is actually an offering that is intended to simply be pleasing to God. It is a pleasing smell, like the smell of a good barbecue, I suppose. And we know this, that this is the kind of offering it is, because the Hebrew word used to describe this first kind of sacrificial offering simply means to go up. This is a going up offering, with the aroma rising up to please the Lord. Just as an aside, as Christians who often become familiar with the New Testament before we dig into books like Leviticus in the Old Testament, it might surprise us that this first offering in the whole book is not operating at all like a parking fine. You know how parking fines work, for some people anyway. A parking fine for some is really a kind of a risk and reward equation. You desperately need a parking spot, and perhaps you take the risk of parking illegally. And when you get caught and have to pay a parking fine, well, that's just the cost. You pay the fine and you get caught, when you get caught, and you move on. This is precisely the opposite of this sacrifice. This is not a cost to be paid, like a fine to be remitted. This is a freely and joyfully given expression of worship. Notice in the description of the sacrifice, there's no trigger event. There is no situation that is described. This very costly sacrifice, an animal from the flock or the herd, was very valuable, especially if you think about a simple farmer in those times. This sacrifice was made freely because of the one to whom it was made. It is a giving of self for the pleasure of another, in this case God. Notice how the worshipper identifies themselves with the sacrifice by placing their hand on its head. This sacrifice says, just as this animal is entirely given over to you, God, in sacrifice, so I give myself entirely to you. I am yours. So that's the first kind of sacrifice, joyfully and freely given dedication to God. Now there are 4 more kinds of sacrifice that are described in this first unit of Leviticus, spanning the first 7 chapters, and they include sacrifices like grain offerings at harvest time and fellowship offerings. Again, these 2 are freely given sacrifices. It's not a penalty to be forfeited like a parking fine. But then there are 2 other kinds of sacrifice that are the sin offering and the restitution offerings, which are more about putting things right with God and with your neighbour. They are the kinds of sacrifice that do find their fulfilment in Jesus Christ at the cross. Sin is taken care of. But what about these freely given expressions of dedication and joy and fellowship? In our day and time, how might we give expression to those responses to God? How and when could we do something, set aside something that we find valuable, simply for the pleasure of God? I'll leave this for your reflection and prayers today.